In this part, we're going to have a look at explanations of attachment. Within this topic, we're going to have a look at learning theory and Bowlby's monotropic theory. Within Bowlby's monotropic theory, you need to be aware of the concept of a critical period and an internal working model. Let's have a look at learning theory. So, there's 3 aspects to learning theory. First one is classical conditioning. So within classical conditioning, we have an unconditioned stimulus, which is food, an unconditioned response, which is pleasure, a neutral stimulus, which is the caregiver. An association is then made between the caregiver and pleasure, and the conditioned stimulus becomes the caregiver, the conditioned response becomes pleasure, so there's an attachment between the infant and caregiver. This is because the caregiver provides the food and the food is linked to the pleasure, but then eventually the caregiver becomes linked to the pleasure. So you should have a formula for classical conditioning that you did in approaches. If you want, you could draw down classical conditioning for attachment as the formula in that format, if that helps you with regards to your revision. The second explanation that we have from learning theory is that of operant conditioning. So this is linked to positive and negative reinforcement. So, when a baby cries, it leads to a response from the caregiver. So, for example, they feed the baby. When the caregiver provides the comfort or the food or the changing of nappies, whatever is necessary, then the crying is positively reinforced. So the baby knows that if it cries, then it's going to get a positive outcome and it's going to feel better in the end. And because attachment is a two-way process, it also suggests that the caregiver is negatively reinforced when they provide the comfort, the food, or they change the nappies, because it stops the crying, so that makes them feel better. So this two-way process between the infant and the caregiver, the positive and the negative reinforcement, strengthens the attachment. Then we have the third concept of a secondary drive. Within this concept, the infant experiences hunger, which is their primary drive. This discomfort drives the infant to attract attention. Then comfort is provided by food, which is a primary reinforcer. When we eat, this drive is reduced, so the infant feels better. And because the caregiver is the source of the reward, they are a secondary reinforcer, so an attachment forms. So within learning theory, you've got 3 different concepts there that you need to be aware of: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and secondary drive. You might want to draw some diagrams or pictures if you're quite a visual learner to help you remember these key things. We have some evaluation points for learning theory. So the first evaluation point is a limitation. So Harlow's research, which we've discussed in part 1, showed that infant monkeys spent more time on the wire monkey with comfort than the wire monkey that provided food. So this suggests that food is not enough for an attachment to form. So comfort is also important, and all the operant conditioning does include the idea of comfort. The secondary drive and classical conditioning mainly focus on the role of food in forming an attachment, but Harlow's research suggests that food isn't the key thing with regards to forming an attachment. Another limitation is that research by Schaefer and Emerson found that infants were attached to people who didn't perform caregiving activities such as bathing, changing, and feeding. This therefore suggests that learning theory doesn't provide a complete description of how attachments form. So it only focuses again on one key factor, with regards to forming an attachment, but Schaefer and Emerson found that infants attached to other individuals who didn't provide caregiving or they didn't provide food to the infant, but they still had attachment to other individuals. However, there is a strength. So conditioning may play a role in attachment, and it may impact an infant's main choice of attachment figure. So it could be that other factors do affect attachment, but conditioning could be the thing that leads an infant to have a primary attachment figure and a preferred attachment figure. However, social learning might be a better explanation. So we can take some aspects of conditioning, but if we apply them to social learning and elaborate on that, then it could be a more holistic explanation. So Hay and Vespo suggests that parents teach children to love them by demonstrating attachment behaviours, and they reinforce these loving behaviours by showing approval when babies display their own attachment behaviours. So it's still got some aspects there. Social learning theory still has some aspects of learning, but it kind of elaborates on that a little bit. So next we have Bowlby's monotropic theory. So this is our next explanation of attachment. So Bowlby proposed an evolutionary explanation for attachment. He suggested that attachment is innate and gives a survival advantage, so it is adaptive. Bowlby suggested that babies have a set of innate behaviours such as smiling, cooing and gripping, and these encourage the attention of adults. So these are called social releases, and these activate a social interaction and make an adult attached to an infant. Bowlby also suggested within his theory that there is a critical period, and if the infant does not develop an attachment during the first 2.5 years of its life, it is impossible for them to form an attachment following this. And we've got some research to support the idea of the critical period when we look at Bowlby's monotropic theory later on. Bowlby suggested this idea of monotropy. Monotropy is the idea that we have a special relationship with a primary attachment figure, and he suggested that there's two key things here. There's the law of continuity, so the more constant and predictable a child's care, the better their attachment, and the law of accumulated separation, so the effects of every separation from the mother add up. So this is linked to the idea of the critical period previously. So if we don't form a special relationship, a monotropic bond with a key figure, due to separation or due to poor care, then this can have effects on later development. And monotropy and the critical period, they are also covered in the theory of maternal deprivation, and in critical period is also covered in institutionalisation as well. Then we have the idea of an internal working model. So an internal working model provides the rules for how an infant behaves in response to others, allowing it to interpret the behaviour and plan its own response. So this is the idea that when you're an infant, you learn, and a child, you learn from your caregivers. So for example, if your caregiver gives you lots of hugs, then when you become a mother or a father, then you will do the same with your child, because you learn how to care for other individuals from your caregiver, because it forms this internal working model. The critical period, monotropy and internal working model are really important, and they're covered in several of the other sections within attachment that we're going to look at. So these ideas will keep cropping up. In evaluation, we have a few strengths and limitations. So the first strength here is further research. So Brazelton in 1975 found support for social releases. They observed babies triggering interactions with adults using social releases, and then they told the primary caregivers to ignore these social releases, and the babies became increasingly distressed. So this showed that social releases were really important in terms of emotional development and attachment. Bailey's research supports the internal working model, and Bailey's research, we will mention that also when we look at attachment in early childhood and adult relationships. So Bailey's research will come up again in this attachment topic. So they found support for the internal working model. They assessed the attachment relationships in 99 mothers and their babies. They measured the mother's attachment to their own primary attachment figures, and they assessed the attachment quality of the babies. They found that mothers with poor attachments to their own primary attachment figures were more likely to have poorly attached babies. So it's this idea that your internal working model is formed through your relationship with your primary caregiver, and that internal working model affects your relationship with your own offspring. Limitation of Bowlby's theory is that the concept of monotropy lacks validity. So Schaefer and Emerson found that infants attached to more than one person, and a significant minority had multiple attachments. So Bowlby's idea that you have one special bond, and Bowlby's original research was interpreted as this special bond should be the mother. It lacks validity according to other opposing research. There's also ethical implications, so this is something that might come up in your issues and debates on paper 3, and you can refer back to Bowlby's research with regards to this. So it's socially sensitive research which impacts caregivers. So mothers may feel as though they cannot leave their children and return to work. They may experience feelings of guilt, and others may view working mothers in a negative way. This is because Bowlby's research was interpreted as being solely about the mother as the primary caregiver. But also it can affect fathers. They may feel that their role is insignificant, and same-sex couples may feel as though they cannot provide the attachment that that child needs. So it's socially sensitive research, and it has impacts on mothers and fathers. So those are your explanations of attachment. So you've got learning theory and you've got Bowlby's monotropic theory. So again, make sure you know the key concepts, make sure you know the key terms, critical period and internal working model, and make sure you have some evidence to support the internal working model. And we will collect some evidence to support the critical period later on. I've got a study that goes along with that. But make sure you know these key words that are mentioned in the advanced information. Make sure you know the theories, the key concepts. Draw some diagrams if it helps you remember them better, particularly with the learning theory. Use those formulas for classical conditioning. A key thing with regards to learning theory, when you're talking about classical and operant conditioning, make sure you don't get it muddled up with the learning approach, because if you talk about Pavlov's dogs or Skinner's rats, then you're automatically getting no marks whatsoever. So make sure there's a clear distinction there between learning theory and attachment, and learning theory and the approach. So make sure you have those two things separate in your mind, and you're aware that when it's attachment, you're talking about food and caregivers. Okay, so yeah, they're the explanations of attachment, and next we'll have a look at Ainsworth's strange situation.